Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
It was a long time ago that I first learned how to drive a car. Well, actually, it was even before I got my driver's license, quite frankly. I remember being 14 years old and my dad driving a motorhome down the freeway just to travel around the country here in the United States. And at 14, him saying, "Hey, come over here." I would slide across his lap to the side by the window where the driver's side was, going about 65 miles an hour down the road. And then he would slide over and he would hand me the wheel and he'd slide out and then walk to the back of the motorhome while it's in transit to go make himself a sandwich or just go lay down and rest. And I would take over driving this giant motorhome at the age of 14, well before I'd hit puberty, by the way. So I look like this little squeaky little 11 or 12-year-old driving this motorhome down the road. And my dad trusted me to do that. And thankfully nothing bad happened. I trusted myself too. Now I'm looking back going, what in the world was that all about? That was crazy, right?
Tales from the 90s.
Yeah, right?
Things that would have never happened. would never happen now.
That was nuts, man. And I'm looking back going, wow, that was kind of risky, but it worked out.
Kind of.
I'm still alive and my family made it.
Your dad is an SP, by the way,
Yeah,
just to give some context.
Yeah, he's an ISFP. And I remember this is just a side note, but I remember driving, when he did that, I remember sitting there thinking, this motorhome going 65 miles an hour down the road, it's like a 25-foot motorhome. And I remember thinking to myself, all it would take is a quick wheel jerk to the right or left, and this entire motorhome would skew off the road and start flipping end to end, like my NE primary, right? It's running the what if simulations of what would happen if I just what if I just tipped the wheel this way? We would all die and it would crash in this fiery destruction. And it kind of unnerved me that I had those visions while I'm driving, right? I was like, oh no, oh my gosh. Anyway, the reason why he trusted me is I would practice driving around my grandfather's property and my dad's property, my parents' property, when I was a kid, 11, 12. I had experience driving around properties at home. And so my dad thought, oh, this is fine. He can handle the interstate, right? And it worked out. And I remember because I'd had that experience, I remember when I went to get my driver's license, I failed my driver test. I think it was either the first or second time. My written test, because I didn't understand. I came from a teetotaling family. I didn't understand alcohol and the effects on your body because no one around me drank. I'd never had an experience around it. So they were like, I think I failed because the question, it was verbal back then when I got this test. They were like, how much alcohol do you have to have in your system for it to be illegal? I was like, I don't know, 10, 15%. And the guy was like, we're going to fail you now because you have no idea what you're talking about. And he was like, it's 0.08% or something. Oh man, okay. I had no idea, right? Anyway, long story short, I failed the driver part of the test at least once. I think it was twice. And you get 3 chances in the state of Pennsylvania before you have to do it again. And I remember thinking to myself, I know how to do this. Why am I not doing well in my driver's test? What's going on here? I finally pass. And then I start to drive. And when you're first starting to drive, on actual roads with a license by yourself, I was my hands are at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I can't have anybody talking to me. I have to have the radio off. I remember being really preoccupied with the right side of the car here in the United States, not to go off the road. I wanted to make sure I wasn't crossing the line. And very intense. It was a very intense experience. And I had to really pay attention. After a few months of doing that, I learned that I could kind of trust myself more. I was still intense, but now I'm starting to put the radio on. And I'm starting to be able to talk to somebody as I drive, and I'm starting to gain some competency around driving. I figure, okay, I can navigate this space. Well, fast forward to today, you and I will probably go out later today to go to the store, and if I'm driving, we will end up at the store, and I will not remember the entire trip. I won't remember how many stoplights I stopped at. I will not have my hands on 10 and 2 on the steering wheel for certain. I will be in conversation with you almost the entire time to where you'll be like, hey, speed up or slow down. I'm not aware of what I'm doing. I'm unconsciously driving this vehicle to our location for better or worse. Sometimes I want to be paying attention more than I am sometimes. But it's weird. I went from, almost being righteously indignant at myself. Why can't I pass this driver's test? Years ago when I first went to get my license to today, when I think I am a good driver. I'm sure there's things I can improve on, but I think I'm a good driver, and certainly I'm an unconscious driver. Certainly I know how to get places unless I'm trying to follow directions, but even then I can turn a GPS on and just follow what the GPS lady tells me, right? And get somewhere without really thinking about it. It's become something unconscious as a skill for me to get from point A to point B. And the reason I'm using this story is a lot of people have this experience. So you listening, you probably, if you drive a car, you probably have had this experience where when you first learned it, you were super intense and preoccupied and fixated on certain aspects of driving. But after you get experience over time, it almost becomes unconscious for you. And you're able to execute on that skill without even thinking about it. And that's really what we want to talk about today, is this idea of how do you go from, and what does it look like to go from somewhere where you don't know at all how to do something and get to the place where you know how to do it so well, you don't even have to think about it anymore.
Right. Well, and I mean, not necessarily talking about how to do that, but putting that concept in a model so that when you are not at a place where you are as good as you think you are, you have a way to sort of assess where exactly you are in the process and not become immodest about it. And I think the lack of modesty, like you were talking about how before you went and took your driver's test, you were like, I have this down, but then you actually sit there in the seat, in the bucket seats, and you got your hands on 10 and 2, and it's so much more difficult than you were expecting, especially since you had these tastes of it before. And then now that you have this the situation where it all falls on you, you've put yourself in a situation where it's do or die, and fortunately, that's sort of the process that everybody goes through with driving, so that's a very common tale. But there are other situations we put ourselves in life where we assume we're much further along than we actually are, or we try to take down other people because we believe we would do better than they are in that situation. And we are actually quite incompetent, but we don't know that because we haven't actually gone through these steps to build skill and competence. So the model that we want to talk about today is Stephen Covey's Competency Model. And we've touched on this in other podcasts. I believe the podcast that we liken this to, the cognitive function stack in your car model. We talked about it in the episode, Why We Resist Developing Our Copilot in Our Personality. So we've likened this competency model to other things, but we just kind of wanted to talk about it in the abstract today because we've ourselves observed our path of recently entering different phases in what ends up becoming a quadrant that we'll introduce in just a moment. We've observed how powerful it is for us to recognize exactly where we are on our path so that we don't keep making the same bad decisions over and over, or that when we've arrived someplace, we have the confidence to be able to behave in a better way. So I find this model, even in the abstract, incredibly helpful just to develop what I think is I used the word before, but the very important quality of modesty. Modesty being that you don't overvalue where you're at, but you also don't undermine where you're at. You have a really sort of accurate, calibrated assessment of your abilities. And I think the more modest we are, I think we can make better choices.
So to introduce the model, basically, either in your mind's eye, imagine a quadrant, or you can even draw it on a paper. So, just draw basically 4 boxes, in a 4-part quadrant. So you've got bottom left, bottom right, top left, top right. And on the left side of that quadrant, the 2 boxes on the left side of that quadrant it's the unconscious side. And on the right side of that quadrant is the conscious side. The bottom 2 boxes in that quadrant or the model is incompetence. And the top 2 boxes of that model is competence. So if you put these together, it's kind of like an XY axis, right? At the bottom left box, you have unconscious incompetence. On the bottom right of that quadrant, you have conscious incompetence. Both are incompetent. One is unconscious, one is conscious. And then at the top right of that model, you have conscious competence. So you feel competent and you're conscious of it. And then the top left of that model is unconscious competence. So you can see that you've got kind of an XY axis, consciousness at the top, consciousness on the right, unconsciousness on the left, competency on the top, incompetency on the bottom. So this is how this plays out in the model.
Most of us start out when it comes to any skill with any challenge to it. So there are certain skills that we just are born having, which is feeding ourselves. I guess maybe as a baby, We don't know how to go gather food, but I guess there's even stories of like babies right after being born crawling up their mother's bodies to go search for a breast. And so like there are certain things we come out of the hatch with, which is like, oh, we have to eat and nourish our bodies. So there are some things we just get, but the more complex or complicated a skill is, the more this model becomes relevant. And as skills become increasingly more complicated, the more likely we are to start out in the unconscious incompetent side. That is almost always the first block in the Candyland game. Like that is where we start. You are here, Dot. We are usually unconsciously incompetent. And the reason why we're unconsciously incompetent is we don't have enough familiarity with the thing to understand how truly complicated it is. And I think we stay here even after we've consumed a high amount of theory. Because I think the other thing that should be flayed out is this idea of theory versus experience. Sometimes, and actually the model that just popped up in my mind and one we have done a podcast on is the DIKW model, which stands for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Most of the time when we're in a theory place, we're gathering data and information. But knowing and wisdom, knowledge and wisdom, those are experiential. And so almost always we start out with a theory because we're made aware of this skill's existence at all. And when we're made aware of a skill's existence, that means that we have to take in some information about what it means to enter the domain of this skill. So we take in data, we take in information, we try to get familiar with what this skill means. And so we're staying in a theoretical place. It's easy when we are taking in theoretical information to project ourselves further along in the competency model and even the DIKW model than we actually are, because we haven't turned it into experience yet. And it's when we really get our feet wet in experience that we start to understand how complicated something truly is, because now we must perform. Like it's on us. We have a responsibility to actually be doing this. Take, for example, with driving. Like you had a little bit of a taste, you had this concept of what driving might be, but when it really fell on you to not just be driving around the back roads of your grandparents' farm or house, and when it wasn't on you to just hold the steering wheel for a small amount of time while your dad was making a sandwich, when it was actually on you to perform all of these tasks and you had yours and other people's lives in your hands, now all of a sudden shit becomes real, right? Like it's a thing and now it's experience. And the projection that you were much further along in this competency model became like the understanding of your projection became real because you realized how bad you actually were, and especially when you were tested.
Yeah, I think I just want to draw attention to that. I think what's interesting about it is I wasn't, to your point, it wasn't lack of any experience at all. There was a little bit of experience, and that's what made it even worse. I think that's why the ego hit was so much there. Like, how did I fail this driver's test? I thought I was good at this thing, but I only had pieces of the thing. I didn't have the whole thing together, right? I only had slices of the skill of driving down. And I think that's one of the things that was shocking to me or surprising to me is that just pieces of it don't necessarily translate to the whole thing. And I had more ego around it because I had those pieces. I think if I had zero experience, I would have come to it a little bit more humble and been like, of course, I mean, the reason I didn't do this well is because I didn't have any experience. I would have cut myself some slack, but I had a little bit of experience. And so my ego was invested and I didn't really cut myself as much slack as I would have had I come fresh, I think.
Yeah, well, and the more complicated the skill is, again, and the more and higher the stakes, the less transferable a lot of these are. Like, as you were talking about this idea of driving and that, yeah, you're unconsciously competent and you just get from A to Z and you don't maybe even remember how you got there because you've just been kind of almost on autopilot. The first thing I thought of was most of us who have been driving for a long time, we don't know that adding a cell phone to the situation immediately puts us in unconscious incompetence again. Because most of us have not spent years developing the skill of driving while looking at a cell phone or being that invested in something with a backlight that takes our time and attention and thought. So I guess it's possible that if you're training on a racetrack where the stakes aren't that high, or not a racetrack, but like, on a track where the stakes aren't that high, and you develop over the course of many years the ability to drive and also look at this backlit thing that requires some of your attention, I guess it's possible that you could become a very competent driver while looking at your cell phone. But because we get on autopilot when we're driving and we go, oh, I've got this. I've been driving for, quite a few years. For me, it's been 25 years now that I've been driving. The assumption is that I'm an excellent driver and I'm unconsciously competent and I'm super good. And I can add this one little component and it's going to be fine, right? And it's like, no, it's not going to be fine. You've just increased your likelihood of getting in an accident by 25%. Or, I don't know. I just pulled that statistic out of my ass. Who knows what it actually is, but I know it's pretty high. And so the idea of thinking that all of these are transferable is another part of that lack of modesty. The more complicated the skill and the higher the stakes, the more likely we are to be in unconscious incompetence when we're at the beginning phase of it. But it's important to remember that that's where we all start out.
I think the switching from a car to a semi-truck would be another example of that. There's a certain skill. Yeah, you know how to drive. You understand how the road system works. You understand how stoplights work and how stop signs work and how you make a turn. But making a turn in a semi is much different than making a turn with a vehicle, because you have to account for this giant trailer behind you and other factors. So even though you might have been driving for the last 20 years, you switch the type of vehicle you're driving, and now it's a whole nother skill set, and that modesty, that might challenge the modesty that you have around that. So then how does one get out of unconscious incompetence into conscious incompetence? And is that even a step up? You're still incompetent. So is that okay? Aren't you supposed to be rushing straight to competence? And isn't the ideal to go straight to unconscious competence? Isn't that what you want to do? And the challenge is that, as Covey says in most of his models, you can't skip steps. It doesn't happen. If you want to get to unconscious competence, you're going to have to go through all of the phases of conscious incompetence and then conscious competence. And then finally, if you invest enough time and effort into the skill, you will eventually, just through muscle memory, become unconsciously competent. So what usually ends up happening is there's a moment of truth. There's an experiential being thrown into the deep end. In order to get the paradigm shift one needs to go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, is there needs to be a testing phase where you're now thrown into the deep end. You're now in a situation where you must perform, and it's not working out like you thought it was going to be. To work out, to pan out. You had this image in your head, this idealization of what it would be like, but once you actually get there, it's a very different ball of wax than you were expecting. You've been babysitting your nieces maybe for the last 10 years, and you're like, I can have a kid. I know what this is like. I can have a child. I got this. And the child comes, and it's a much different experience than babysitting your nieces maybe, right? It's a much different thing for you, and you're like, oh, maybe this experience is telling me maybe I don't have down what I thought I had down, right? This is something that throwing in the deep end with that experience really gives you a lot of feedback of what you know and what you don't know.
Yeah, or you're complaining about your supervisor endlessly, right? That person is just an idiot. They don't know what they're doing. I would run this department so much better. And then the opportunity comes, right? Maybe you get a promotion, and then all of a sudden you're lead or manager or maybe even supervisor, and you're like, oh, there was a bunch of institutional knowledge and back-end information I wasn't aware of, and this is actually quite complicated. I think that is actually being sort of played out in leadership all over the place. I see a lot of people assuming leadership that they didn't actually have a modesty around of how complicated it actually was. They were unconsciously incompetent, maybe because they were good leaders in another element, or maybe they just had some success and they assumed that the success was transferable, and they get to a position of leadership, and all of a sudden the reality of the leadership hits them, and now they understand, oh, maybe this was way bigger than I was expecting. And I see this particularly in a leadership frame because I see a lot of attempts to dethrone happen. There is a lot of, in the sort of the unconscious gestalt right now, there's a lot of attempts to dethrone in all sorts of categories. And you can see that when these leadership positions create vacuums and somebody steps into it, it's almost always much more difficult than they were expecting. And I'm also observing people buckling under the weight. And I'm not even picking on any particular... I'm not even picking on an institution, an infrastructure, a particular persuasion of ism, right? It doesn't really matter. I'm seeing it everywhere. everywhere I look, there is an attempt to dethrone, a vacuum created, somebody entering that vacuum and then going, oh shit, this was bigger than I thought. So I think one of the reasons why the competency model is so good is because it gives us an ability to work up to where we want to be without entering that place and then buckling under the weight of what we said yes to. It's one of those things where they say, be careful what you wish for. You might actually get it. I believe if a person has had modesty in walking through the competency model, they don't have to worry about that. They don't have to be careful what they wish for, because what they're wishing for is the process of becoming better over time so that when they get to the place they need to get to, they're ready for it. So there's this moment of truth. You have this situation where the experience is requiring something out of you that you were not expecting. Or maybe you entered it and you're like, I got this. And then at the end of all of it, you're like, maybe I didn't have this. Help is usually the word. And you're looking for a safety net, and some things have safety nets and some don't. Some of them will be much kinder come to Jesus moments than other things will be, but you'll have a come to Jesus moment and you'll go, okay, maybe this is different than I thought it was. And then you're occupying actually what is a very desirable situation of conscious incompetence. And the reason why it's desirable is that on the left-hand side of this quadrant in the unconscious, just pluck the word unconscious out and put the word thoughtless in. It's not thoughtful. You're not putting any thought into it. Now, if you're unconsciously competent, it's because you have muscle memory that is quote unquote doing the thought for you. You actually have just an ability to sort of go on autopilot, and it's still going to pan out, but you're not actually putting conscious thought into it. So the desirable thing about hitting this right side of the quadrant, especially from the starting point of the Candyland and conscious and competent, is that you're now in a thoughtful place. You now actually can sort of embed your own ideas into it and on concepts, and you're actually learning. It's the first position of true learning. If you stay in unconscious incompetence, learning doesn't happen there. And that's why that is the most presumptive and assumptive position in all four quadrants. You're just projecting your own ideas, your ideations, the things you think is how it works. You're very assumptive and presumptive. If it doesn't pan out the way that you think it should, one of the ways that you know that you're making the choice to enter conscious incompetence versus staying in unconscious incompetence is that victimhood lives in unconscious incompetence. When you are testing your mettle and it doesn't work out, you'll know you haven't moved to the next level if you actually feel like it was personal. If you think that something should have been different than a learning experience. If you take it personally and you remain a victim, it means you're stuck in this quadrant. But if you go, okay, well, maybe it's different than I thought it was, right? And I have some things I got to learn. You get out of a presumptive or assumptive state. You get out of victimization. You end up going, I think there are things here that I need to learn. And if I choose to continue developing this skill, then I'm going to have to be in a student role. I'm going to have to stay in student role here. I can't be the person who knows. I can't be the person who has the swagger. I got to take the ego hit, and I just got to be a person who is in information gathering, observation, and going from data to true information in DIKW.
I think that's a really great point, Antonia, that you can tell if you're in this when you feel kind of victimized by things that you don't understand what's happening, and it's almost like the ideas and the assumptions you brought the quote unquote word is should be working out. Like, this should be working out, and it's not, and that can be very frustrating. I think this is a cycle we go through. All of us go through when we exit our childhood years from, my dad used to have this saying. He used to say, hey, 16-year-old, you should move out of your mom and dad's house, get a job, and settle down while you still know everything, right? It's kind of this idea like when you're young and you're a teenager and then you go through college, you have a lot of learning you've been doing, and you could almost look at that and say, well, that means I'm in conscious incompetence. I'm in that learning frame. But I really think a lot of us, when I was young, I did this. I assumed being an adult was going to be something very different. And I got a wake-up call. Like I jumped off being a child, being a college student into the deep end of adulthood, of getting married and starting a job, starting my life. And I realized, whoa, there's a lot more to this. There were some things mom and dad were covering for me, and my college was covering for me. and the institutions around me were covering for me. And now I'm on my own. I'm out in the deep end swimming by myself. And there's more things I have to take into account than I thought I was going to have to. And it was an instant wake-up call for me as a young man to say, I have more learning to do. Even my first marriage, I entered it thinking marriage is easy. You just be open and honest and forthcoming and really try to honor that marriage. And I had a wake-up call to the point where it didn't last, right? And I had a new understanding of, wow, I really overvalued what I was bringing here. I was so unconsciously incompetent with just being a husband and in a partnered relationship. I had a lot to learn, but I had assumptions on what that meant. I used to think like, what? Why do couples fight? It's easy. You just blah, blah, blah. I had all the right answers, right? And I hear this term too, to your point, Antonia, and to this, what I'm saying here, I hear a lot of young people right now use this term called adulting. They've turned this concept of being an adult into a verb. It's no longer something you are, it's something you're doing. It's like you're playing at it or something. I'm adulting, quote unquote. I got to go adulting today. And it's weird to me to hear that because I'm like, wait, you are an adult. Why do you have to turn what you are into a verb? And I think it's this play. I think it's this tension point young people struggle with. I certainly struggle with it when you're transitioning from that unconscious incompetence of youth into conscious incompetence of young adulthood. And you realize just how much you may not know. And I think that to the word, adulting, I think that's kind of a funny way to play on this. It's basically saying, hey, I feel a little incompetent around what I'm doing now as a 20-something. Or sometimes I hear it from 30-somethings too.
Or 40-somethings.
Yeah. So, but the point is that I think this is a wake-up call for all of us as we transition from childhood into young adulthood. And I think it's a common human experience, regardless of your generation, your context, whatever. I'm sure for the history of humanity, we've all had this experience in some way or another of having that wake-up call like, oh man, shit's getting real kind of moment. And I think that we're zoomed in on this because I think this is where a lot of that victimhood conversation comes from, or like helplessness comes from, or turning the word of being an adult into the verb adulting, right? It's something I'm playing at. I think this all is wrapped in here somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, Korzybski might be proud because it's an E-prime thing to do, to take a nominalization of adult and turn it into a verb of adulting.
Sure.
But I don't think that that's why they're doing it. I don't think it's a nod to Korzybski. So, anyway.
And that's reference to our General Semantics podcast we recorded.
That's right, General Semantics. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a sense of resistance sometimes to this quadrant, even though it's a step up. It really should be seen as a step up. I think there's some resistance to it because there's not a lot of insecurity that lives in unconscious incompetence because you don't know enough to be insecure. There's a lot of Darwin Awards that live there, right? There's a lot of really stupid decisions that are made that might, put you and others in jeopardy, whatever that means. But those are almost incidental, and sometimes they feel like they weren't your fault, even though you might have been the node in the system that created them. But in conscious incompetence, this is where self-doubt lives. This is where insecurity lives. This is where ego hits live. This is way out of comfort zones. Like, this quadrant feels probably the worst of all four of them. This is the worst feeling quadrant. And yet it's one of the most crucial. Like the step to go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, the step to do that might be the most crucial because it's the one we have a tendency to avoid the most because of all of those feelings that we don't want to feel. This is where ego work is super helpful because if you do ego work, which is like, yeah, okay, I can take it. I can take when I'm, messing up. I can take when I've not arrived. I can take the ego hits of pride. Like, I don't have to be there. I've got enough humility. Like, if you can start working on that path, I think the reason why it's such a leverage point is that it will grease the wheels of going from the one quadrant to the next. It's actually one of the most helpful ways for you to build skill because ego work tears down the resistances you have to acknowledging your own incompetence, and which is the first step of actually building a skill. So that's one of the reasons why people don't like being here, but spending time here is incredibly valuable. And it's what you have to do to move to the next quadrant of conscious competence. Now, conscious competence lets go of insecurity and self-doubt, but because it's conscious, it stays in the thoughtful side. And so you still have to put thought into things. It's not just coming to you easily. It's not muscle memory. You just know, okay, I think I've got this, but there's energy you have to apply to it because you're still figuring some things out. You still have to apply endeavor to it, and you have to do regular checks.
Yeah, if you go back to the story of me driving, after spending some months with hands on 10 and 2 and the radio off, I can't talk to anybody, I got to focus on the road. I was able to turn on the radio after a while, and I was able to talk to people. I'm starting to add in other elements because I feel more confident and more competent around driving. I'm starting to feel this out. Now I kind of get how much I've got to start slowing down before I stop at a stoplight. I don't have to think about it as much. There's some of the muscle memory starting to connect itself, right? On some of the basic things. I can maybe take my hand off the wheel to, pick up a drink and drink it. I don't have to keep both hands on the wheel at all times because now I've got a little bit more sense of myself. I'm not so fixated and just constantly looking at the right side of the road to make sure I'm not going over the shoulder too much. I'm more rested in it. I feel more really confident in myself because I'm starting to feel like I've got competency around this skill. And yet I'm still paying attention. I still can't just turn off within the first few months or year of me driving. It was not on autopilot yet. I still had to pay attention to what I was doing, but it was starting to get easier. It was starting to feel better. I felt more confident, and I was able to drive without feeling all that anxiety and the emotions around it as much, right? Of like trying to pay attention to all these things. So I think that's where that's like an example of how this might show up in an actual experience. And maybe in someone's life, they've gone through that kind of, oh no, adult life is harder than I thought. And they start to get a handle on it. They get the job they need. They start getting the relationship they want. They're starting to connect things they understand. And now they're like, okay, I think I got life a little bit better. I'm paying the bills every month. I'm making sure I take care of all the things I need to take care of. I have a relationship. I'm starting to understand how that works. I've got friends. I can manage my schedule. I feel pretty confident about my basic life now. I've got a sense of it. Now, I still have to be vigilant. I got to remind myself on certain things and moving through life. I still have some challenges here and there, but overall, I feel stable. I feel like I'm an adult and I've got this, and I've got a sense of competency around moving through the world. And I think that's an experience we all have too as we continue to mature and grow up. Again, some of these are just natural in our normal growth processes. And then we apply it to skills, specific skills we want to learn. That's when it gets really acute. That's when we can start to see this model play out outside of things like just driving or adulthood, like things you want to learn or challenges you want to do in the world or things you want to have happen in the world. This is where this model starts to really become helpful. But this is just kind of some examples, I think, of how that plays out.
Yeah, there's a boost of self-esteem in this quadrant. Absolutely. Which feels really good, especially having just left Conscious Incompetence, which is very self-esteem pummeling. It's a student role, and I think Conscious Competence is one of the best teacher roles, actually, because it's still thoughtful. And so you're still putting thought into how it's working, and it's one of the best places to be able to model yourself. And like you mentioned, there's a vigilance here. And so when you're vigilant, then that means that you're taking into account all of the different things that can go off the rails, all the things that could go wrong. And so I think actually conscious competence is the best place to teach something. Because once you get to unconscious incompetence, you get back into a thoughtlessness place, and you are it's like so wordless, it's hard to explain what you're doing. But in this place, you can explain what you're doing because you're still watching yourself. You're still like sort of breaking it down.
This happened to us in our profiler training program in a lot of ways. Like in some ways, it's been a challenge to continue teaching this as it becomes more of an unconscious process for us. We get up to teach something and we forget what we didn't know when we were learning it, right? And we just, because we're doing it so much, we're doing some of these things so much, sometimes we forget what it was like. And we have to remember, we almost have to put ourselves back in that conscious competence place, get away from the unconscious competence and get back into, okay, what's this like when someone doesn't have this as muscle memory? What are they going to have challenges with? What's this going to feel like? And I think as you teach more, as someone teaches more and more, it can be challenging to continue to stay in the framework of a beginner's mind and help contextualize it. So like you said, oftentimes teachers in this place, we think of that Marlon Brando experience where he tried to teach acting. He's a famous actor, right, from the 1950s. He tried to teach acting, and it was a terrible class that he led. And because his instruction was, okay, go ahead and act now. Like that was basically the instruction. And they were like, well, how do I do that? And he's
What's
like,
the technique?
He's like, well, I just do it. So here, just do it. And that was because he was so unconsciously competent at it. He needed to access more of that time period in his life when he was still learning the skill and be able to translate that to his students. But he was unable to do that, and his acting class was terrible. And so I think a lot of us, you're right, this is a great place to be teaching from. And it actually is probably the teaching part of it will also help kick you over into the muscle memory, unconscious part of being competent around that as well.
Well, as long as the teaching is in combination with extended experience, it's a very articulate portion. Like the conscious portion of either conscious competence or even conscious incompetence is articulate. Like most of the time when a person says, if you're in conscious incompetence and the person's like, why can't you do this? You usually have a lot of reasons why you're not good at it. Like, I haven't done it enough. There's some things that I've tried and haven't worked out. Like, it's a very articulate place because it's thoughtful. And so you have to put thought into it. When you're consciously competent, you're also articulate, and you're articulate about how to go about the technique because you still have to keep that in mind. But as long as the teaching and the articulation is in combination with extended experience, because the way to go from each quadrant to the next one is to put yourself in a context that expands your understanding. Like, you have to push yourself. You have to get out of your comfort zone. You've got to get in a place that you're building skill over time. And the only way to build skill is to not do the same thing over and over. You have to put yourself in situations that push what you know to the next level. And so while it's one of the best for teaching, if you only ever teach at this quadrant, I believe that you will actually never enter unconscious competence, because you're just focused on the technique, and you're staying in theory really, and you're not pushing yourself to extend. But I think what's nice about being here too is not just that it's articulate and you can model and you can feel self-esteem. But I think what's nice about it is you become this is a good place to become a model to others and to actually get that boost of self-esteem to keep going. So I'm thinking about myself this year. One of the challenges is that when it comes to like marketing and business, I mean, podcast was started in 2014. And the business is at a pretty good place at this point, and it continues to get better, and we have ambitions, and we keep wanting to go. But I think because of the early days of it, I had a lot of come to Jesus moments about what I didn't know. And so I've been kind of, when it comes to marketing and to the business half of PH, I think I've been living in the conscious incompetence square or quadrant. I just keep thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I leave it to Joel. He's the person who knows. He's got all this marketing, like background, and like he got his master's in communication, and he just knows what he's doing, and he's so good at this. And so I've been, I think, living in conscious incompetence for a super long time until I was tested this year. And through the tests of what I know how to do and what I don't know how to do, over the last 6 months, I felt myself move into conscious competence around marketing. And I mean, it's not like I've been like reading up on a bunch of marketing theory or anything. I mean, I've read the books I'm supposed to read, but I think this year I was put in situations where it was required that I step up and perform in ways that I haven't really had to in the past. And I realized that over time, I've actually gotten some chops here. I kind of know how this thing works, and I've written some copy, and I've written some marketing strategies, and now all of a sudden I have a boost of self-confidence that's making me, instead of wanting to avoid all of the marketing elements, I'm actually like ready. I'm like, yeah, let's do this. This is awesome. Let's get back into like how's the business structured, and how are we going to do all this stuff, and what's our marketing strategy, and I think that's been so nice, because I have a feeling that this sort of wind in my sails is going to push me to do even more in this quadrant. And then maybe, I don't know, because also talent comes in here a little bit, and interest. But I'm hoping that if I really apply myself, I'll get to a place where I eventually hit unconscious competence, which would be amazing. Now, I'm not giving myself any promises, because I also recognize that I focus more on content, and that's sort of been my wheelhouse. But I think that just getting the boost of recognizing that I've entered this quadrant has been better for me, not just me, but better for PH as well.
I want to talk about that for a moment. That self-esteem you talk about, because I think it's such a self-esteem hit to be on the bottom right of that model when you are consciously incompetent at something. You know you suck at this. You feel foolish, you feel silly, it feels awful. You don't feel intelligent, you don't feel like you're good at, it's just a terrible place to be. It's been my experience that in this quadrant, that of all the 4 places in this quadrant, that's the place that occupies the most time, quite frankly, because you're trying to build skill, you're aware you're trying to build skill, and it's a lot of fits and starts and, oh man, I messed up, I got to calibrate, I got to try again. And you try and try and try, and sometimes it feels like you'll never get out of this place. And it might go on for weeks, depending on the skill, depending on the situation, weeks, months, years. Sometimes it feels like you may never get out of it. Some people have been stuck here for decades around certain things, right? And I think that we all have an instinct for that. We all know that there's a lot of suffering when we are made aware of what we don't know. And when we're with people that do know what they should be doing around these skills, in a business context or something, it's very much like, oh man, I'm less than that person. They have more competency around this. They know what they're doing. And a couple comments on this that I see play out. First of all, I think the avoidance of this place is very high, because we kind of understand that, we almost, like when someone tries to tell us that we're incompetent around something, or the universe is giving us a message, we want to plug our ears and go, la, 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 I don't hear you, because we want to stay with a belief that we know what the heck we're doing. So we avoid even going here. But let's go ahead and say that you get over to here and you feel incompetent around something. I think one of the things that comes from this, instead of looking at it as skill, oh no, I feel silly and stupid because I like the response. I think the more healthy response is to feel silly and stupid, not feel silly and stupid, feel deficient because you don't have a skill. But I think what happens when people get here, not all the time, but often, is they conflate the lack of skill and the feeling incompetent with a power dynamic. So they look at this and they say, I feel like I don't know what's going on here. I feel incompetent. That must be because everybody's got power over me. And the reason why I feel incompetent here, and this is super unconscious, I don't think people are consciously thinking this, is because people have power over me. They're in positions of power and they're keeping me down. They're putting me in a place where I'm deficient. They set up a system that would require me to look silly and stupid and not know what's going on. Shame on them. Those stupid people in power put me in this place, huh? And then you enter another model, which is the drama triangle, right? This drama triangle where there's a victim, villain, hero, and you often put yourself in the victim place. You just translate the victim of not knowing what's going on, being completely unconscious and incompetent, and you translate it and you bring it over to this side of the quadrant. And now, instead of going, all right, maybe I'm not that great, maybe I don't know everything, maybe I need to work on skill, instead of saying that and getting to work, you go, oh, there's a power imbalance. That's why I feel the way I feel. And so instead of getting to work to hustle, you then try to figure out ways why it's everybody else's fault. And then I think what happens there is you either abandoned this and you run back away from it. Like this is too much. I don't want to learn this skill. I have no desire to learn this skill. I don't want to be here. The power imbalance is too much anyway. Who cares? I don't care. It wasn't important in the first place. Who gives a crap? I'm leaving this strategy. And you abandon ship, or sometimes what I see is it's an attempt to either topple the power structure or move the goalposts so you don't feel so bad about not knowing something. So it's like there's two strategies. It's like, well, if I only topple the power that's keeping me in this place of feeling incompetent, then I'll feel better. Then I'll feel competent because the power that's keeping me here will be out of the way. Or you say, and this is kind of related to hitting the powers, you say, well, to be competent in this area isn't X, it's actually Y. And for everybody to tell me that to be competent here, I have to have X skill, I don't agree with that. I think the goalpost needs to be moved. We need to change the definition of what competent looks like. So that way I don't have so much work to have to meet it. Again, I think this is very unconscious for us as young people. And I think every generation struggles with it. It's my opinion that and it's probably because I'm an older person now, right? I'm like approaching middle age, and every generation looks back on the younger generation like, you kids these days. And so there's some of that, and I account for that. But I also say that I think the generation right now that's coming up, at least around this topic, has a tendency to have their lens focused on this, on either toppling the power structures because they feel incompetent, or moving the goalposts, or abandoning ship altogether around learning this thing. Those are kind of the three strategies I see that are at play. And I think that if you can stay with it and plow through this and build the skill and the competency you need, true self-esteem lives on the other end. You can't synthesize this. True self-esteem is calibration. You have to mess up and you got to try again. And if it doesn't work out, you try again. And if it doesn't work out, you keep trying until you figure out what the heck's going on here. And again, talent, skill, and interest play into this as well. But like interest, talent, and the ability to develop the skill, right? So I'm never going to be in the NFL as a linebacker. I'm just not built for it. No matter how much I try, I'm never going to be that. So obviously, I'm always going to be incompetent. I'm going to be consciously incompetent at being a linebacker in the NFL. So there's limits to this. But in most scenarios, the thing you're going after is something you probably can go after, right? It's probably not a pipe dream of being a linebacker in the NFL. And so I think this is something that I see at play. And I think that when you're in this place, it's so easy to do those things I just mentioned. And that's the thing I'd encourage you listening, if that's your strategy, is to reevaluate that strategy and say, maybe I shouldn't look at the power structure as keeping me here. Maybe I shouldn't abandon, and maybe I shouldn't try to move the goalposts. What if I just became resourceful and figured this out? Wow. And at the end of that is self-esteem. That's the reward you get. Imagine you feeling amazing about this thing. You have competency around it. You've mastered it. And you're coming from a place of competency in your life. That's exciting to me. That's been exciting in my life. I think for Antonia as well. And for you listening, I think that's exciting for you to see a vision of what you can be in front of you and challenge yourself to it. I think that's what the message is that I would want to communicate with this little model here for you listening.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, just to clarify, it's not that there isn't an imbalance of power. Like, that's accurate. Like, there are imbalances of power, and there's an incredibly
certainly
unfair situations that people experience all the time. And there is definitely hierarchies, and
of course
those things all exist. But I think, kind of hearkening back to something we were talking about earlier, which is, if you succeed at toppling the power structures, you got to be ready for it.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to, and you probably won't topple them anyway without that competency.
Yeah, well, exactly. And if you do, it's almost worse, because now there is a vacuum and nobody who's capable of filling them. And so being like getting out of the mentality that says, if we only could take people down, everything would be okay. It's like, well, you have to be maybe that's an okay strategy. I don't know. But simultaneously, you can't, I don't think it works to simultaneously have the mentality of that strategy itself will work. It's got to be coupled with what you're talking about, Joel, which is a modest assessment of whether or not you're ready to feel whatever vacuum is created, which is a modest assessment of where you're actually at, and moving goalposts and, giving yourself reasons and outs is not preparation work. Like, to prepare, like if you want to topple power structures, more power to you. Just make sure you're ready if you succeed.
Yeah.
And once you succeed, just make sure that you went through the competency model to become at least consciously competent, so that when you enter that space, you don't create a worse situation. Because it's actually, it's almost like when an infrastructure is corrupt, it's better than no infrastructure. And we've seen that because the other option is anarchy. And then it turns into a survivalocracy. So it's like, just make sure that as you're trying to dethrone people, that you're qualified to wear a crown once they're dethroned.
Yeah, I think this speaks to what Jordan Peterson talks about. He's like, if you want to go change the world, like, go clean up your room. And he's got a lot of pushback from that, but really it speaks to this competency model. He's saying, if you want to be competent and change the world, change yourself first. There's no way you're going to have the skill to go put the world in order if you can't put your bedroom in order. And it sounds like almost a silly message, and people are very dismissive of what he says there. And a lot of people don't like him for other reasons. But I think it really speaks to this, is put your own house in order, build competency, and then you can go and begin to make a change in the world. But without that skill, without that competency, you will always be coming from a deficient place. And then the only thing you'll have to fall back on is, like we talked about, move goalposts, play the victim, whatever. And I don't think that's not going to be helpful to anybody, and certainly you listening.
Yeah. So I think I think of all four of these quadrants, the one that is the toughest, but maybe the most crucial to master, is conscious incompetence. And it's crucial to master all elements of it. Just entering the quadrant takes some mastery. It takes some training on your character to be able to take sort of the ego hit, and navigating your way through, resting into it, staying with it, remembering that the way out is through. Like, all of that is tough to master at this quadrant, but it's super crucial. But of course, you get this bump in self-esteem when you get to conscious competence. And if you continue to build skill, if you continue to, sort of test yourself and keep pushing yourself to bigger and bigger challenges and getting outside of your comfort zone, eventually you get to unconscious competence, which is a beautiful place to be. It's a place of knowing. It's a place of muscle memory, of gut instincts. It's a place where things feel really easy to you. The challenge is that once you get there, sometimes you forget how difficult it is for other people to not be there with you. So one of the things you have to remember when you're in the unconscious competence place is that it's hard to explain to people how they can follow your path. You're kind of out of that teaching element, that articulation element, and into like a non-lingual place again. But as you mentioned with Marlon Brando elements, Marlon Brando might have been the worst acting teacher of all time, but he's simultaneously one of the greatest actors of all time. So that's when we get virtuoso levels. That's when you get sort of the place where people are like, they just perform with apparent genius. Sometimes it's difficult to explain your reasons for things when you get here, though, because it is unconscious. So you're back in sort of the thoughtless place. Not that you're not being a thoughtful person, but the thing itself doesn't require thought. So sometimes it's hard to articulate and put out in words. And sometimes it's tough for people to tell the difference between unconscious incompetence and unconscious competence, because they both look kind of similar since they're both in the unconscious state. So then the question becomes, how do you know you're unconsciously incompetent versus unconsciously competent? Because they're both in the unconscious side. And that's the hubris of unconscious incompetence, is the assumption that they're actually competent. Like, that's its hubris. And for me, I don't have like the answer, but I have an answer that I've employed in my own life, which is I ask myself, if I really believe that I'm unconsciously competent, can I map out or chart out when I went through each of these quadrants? Do I remember a time when I had a come to Jesus moment where I was consciously incompetent? Do I remember that? Do I remember being insecure and feeling like I was never going to get it and maybe I should just abandon ship? And do I remember getting to a moment where I went, oh, hey, well, maybe I'm okay at this. Maybe I got this down. And then do I remember a time period of, thoughtfully moving through extended skill building and modeling and figuring out how it all works into a place where I just all of a sudden one day didn't have to think about it anymore? So if you're wondering where you're at in the model on the unconscious side in any particular skill, like, see if you can map out. And I wouldn't even say, like you mentioned, Joel, with driving, you might have been able to convince yourself that you had gone through all of this because of the taste of experience you got with driving around your grandparents' place, or grabbing the wheel of the motorhome in very sort of panic-inducing, dangerous early 90s fashion. But you might have been able to convince yourself of that, but those weren't extended time periods. Those weren't like cycles or seasons you lived through. That was just incidental moments and hit of experience. But if you can actually sort of chart it out and go, this was the time period of life in which I felt this way, and these were the things that helped facilitate me going to the next season of life. And then when I was in this season of life, here's all the things I was doing to build my skill in order to get to the final season of life. And I think if you can't really map something out with some pretty clear, these are the cycles, these are the transitions, this is when I was doing this thing, and maybe even have evidence of tests. I think tests are the most important thing. Life gives us a lot of tests to be able to sort of show ourselves what we're made of. And so if you can think of the tests that life threw you and how maybe you failed initially. In fact, that would be the first sign, is that you actually royally messed up at some point. And so if you can remember that and go, yeah, actually I failed pretty bad back there, that was probably me entering conscious incompetence, and I lived in that space and sort of germinated in it for a while. But I mastered that quadrant, which is hard to do. I mastered it, and I didn't resist it, and I surrendered to it, and I built my skill, and eventually I felt that, hey, I think I've got this boost, that wind in the sails boost of self-confidence. And then eventually you stopped having to think about it once you continue to build your skill. If you can really truly map that out, you probably are at unconscious competence. But if you don't have one of those skill maps in your head, and you think you got this, but you've never been tested truly, then you probably are still at unconscious incompetence. And that's okay, because that's where everybody starts with all skills. And it's not a bad thing. And in fact, the entire process isn't a bad thing. It's very natural. And I think once we get to a place where we really can show up and have mapped all that through, I think that's when we can really give our gifts to the world.
I think to move through from the unconscious incompetence, the bottom left, to conscious incompetence, it feels like that's going to be bravery that's needed in order to move there, and the willingness to take the ego hit, the feeling that you're maybe, you're going to feel deficient basically, and be okay with that and say, you know what, I'm just learning this. I'm going to feel silly and foolish, and it's cool. I'm learning this skill. And then the next step into moving from conscious incompetence into conscious competence is going to be surrendering to the work that you have to do to get there. You have to just basically surrender and say, I already took the ego hit to get in this place. Now I have to surrender the work to get up out of this, to go from conscious incompetence up to conscious competence. I have to basically just surrender, and I got to put the time in. I just have to put the time in. There's no other way to make this happen except to put the time in. You can try to topple power, you can try to change the goalposts, but ultimately if you want the self-esteem and the actual competency, you're going to have to just put the time in, just period. And then you get in there, that conscious competence. Now you're there, and it's basically probably a willingness to let go of, when you are conscious of what you're working on and you're disciplined, you've surrendered to the work, you're putting the work in, you're conscious of the work you're doing. At some point, it's basically burning the books, really, at this point. It's going to be, burning the reference guides and trusting your own gut in a way is the next step to move to the left to unconscious competence. When you let go of all the templates and all the things you worked really hard and all the skills you built that worked and all the reference points, you have to almost, burn the books and move, not burn the books like a Hitler way, burn the books in like a reference way and move left to the unconscious competence side. And I think then you're starting to trust your gut. You still have those references, but you're not reliant on them. You break your dependency on them, right? You break the dependency of having those things that you're consciously thinking about, the conscious reference guides, whatever it is that you've learned, and you let that go, and now you're able to float on your own with a skill that is ingrained into who you are, not what you do. It's who you are now. It just comes with you as a package, and you've worked through building that, and that is an incredible, empowering place to be. I want to tell you, I have some of these in my life that I've connected over time with hard work, and when you get there, you feel like you are unstoppable. You have now self-esteem from the last place you just came to. And with that self-esteem, it's almost a deep sense of knowingness. It's hard to explain. You just have a sense of yourself, this sense of just moving through the world that's like, I got this. And not with everything, but the things you built skill around. And then they start to stack on each other. And those start to create like complex competencies, right? Where you start to have interdisciplinary competencies that are unconscious for you. As you start to layer them into your life, it's unfortunate that we all die by the time we're like 70 or 80, right? Because like by that time, ostensibly, if we've gone through this cycle enough with enough things, we know a lot. We're able to do a lot. We have a lot of wisdom. We've been able to connect a lot of things. And that deep knowingness of experience is one of the reasons why I love talking to people that are much older than me. They have so much wisdom. People that are seemingly not like with it now, like they're not maybe in a career right now, and maybe a career that's obsolete even, or something that wouldn't necessarily play out to life now, they still have the experience of going through a competency model on multiple levels and connecting them in aggregate. There is wisdom there, and don't discount that with people that are much later stages of life, because they can teach you something, even if it's not directly connected. There's something there they have experience and knowingness around that you can benefit from. So that's another encouragement, is to seek people out like that too.
Yeah, I think book burning is the ultimate symbol of unconscious incompetence, because book burning is a symbol that you don't want to know what you don't know. But I think when you say, I mean, I was just thinking about that when you're like, not in a Hitler way, not in a Fahrenheit 451 sort of way, but I was like, that would be actually unconscious incompetence and never wanting to move out of that quadrant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, book burning in the sense, remember in the, if you've seen it, spoiler alert, Last Jedi, give you a moment to disconnect if you don't want to spoiler. But remember that scene in The Last Jedi when he's connecting with Yoda, and then all of a sudden the library's burning up. He's like, you don't need those books. You're good. You got this. Remember, that's the metaphor is kind of that sense of like, you don't need the reference guides. I'm not saying like burn them because you think you know more.
I knew what you meant. I just was thinking about that though. That was my any tangent, my extroverted intuition connection tangent. So I was just realizing, because I mean, this is basically complete. We can wrap it up. But I was just thinking, no matter what we call this podcast, it's going to be extremely unsexy. Competency model, incompetency model.
Well, like 5 people that listen to it by the name.
So we're probably going to have to name this something a little clickbaity. I don't know what that is yet, but we'll probably have to name it something a little clickbaity so that people will actually click on it. So I just want to apologize for whatever name we come up with, because I'm sure it was clickbait. Just to make sure that people are actually listening to it, because it will just be the most unsexy title. Yeah,
it is always a challenge, because like working on yourself, personal growth sometimes isn't very sexy. And thinking about these things is like, I mean, it's hard work sometimes, and you have to think in terms that are not 5 steps to, get the boyfriend back or whatever.
Thinner thighs.
Yeah, it really, like, life actually is more complicated than the headlines would make it sound, right? In all the things that we do in life. So we've been doing a lot of talking around the competency model, and we want to hear from you, because there's been something in your life that you've worked through, that you've gone through this model. You probably have something in your life you can map out and walk through where you see the stages of building competency, and you are unconsciously competent around something or some things in your life. I'd love to hear that story. And also, what are some things that you are struggling with in this? Have you found yourself stuck in that area we talked about with the conscious incompetence? Have you had to take an ego hit? Have you seen yourself look for ways to change power structures or move the goalposts or avoid it and run and retreat when the going got tough? Or have you pushed through and you've had a success story of moving into conscious competence, and you feel like, man, I got this now. I have self-esteem because I pushed through. I went and did that medical school, and I feel like I got it, and now I'm a doctor or whatever, and I'm working in the craft or the industry I wanted to work in, or I became an artist, or whatever it is that you hooked up to. And maybe it's around relationship. Whatever it applies to, we'd love to hear your story. The best place to share your story, leave a comment, ask a question, is over at personalityhacker.com. You can do that right below this episode. And we want to hear from you. We think your voice is important in the community, and we want to hear your voice because it's part of the conversation.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating review on iTunes, that's awesome. We also have a book out. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at lots of different book outlets. And if you would leave us a rating review of the book on Amazon, if you have read it and you enjoyed it, please feel free to do that too.
Let me do a better call to action than that one.
Okay.
Hold on, wait. Go get the new book, Personality Hacker. It's available in booksellers everywhere, and you can get it on Amazon or online retailers. You got to have this book. It's a great book. It'd be a great addition to your reference library. It would also make a great gift to give to a friend or family member. So go get the book as soon as you can.
You're pointing out my conscious incompetence at pitching our book.
Well, but what's good about it is right before that, you kind of did and then I metaed it and said I'm going to do a more direct, so it didn't sound so salesy and markety.
It's true.
And yet it probably will, and I'd still mean it, go get the book.
Yeah.
But it also kind of softened the weird, and if you act now, like that kind of voice, so.
Let's wind it down.
All right. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.